This is Dr. David Borges. I'm a local chiropractic doctor in South Lake Tahoe, California, and a Lake Tahoe historian. Today we're going to be going over the Lake Tahoe railroads and the Transcontinental railroads. But before we get started with the program, you know you're a Tahoe local if you realize that washing your car is a better predictor for stormy weather than the National Weather Service. You also know you're a Tahoe local if you have not found your house keys in 5 years, and it really doesn't matter. And if you find 28 degrees just a little chilly. But let's talk about the coming of the railroads across the United States. When California was granted statehood in 1850, there was a fever pitch to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific overland via railroad. And it was 1862, by watching the number of washoe wagons that were going over from Placerville to Virginia City, where there was 3 wagons and 20 tons each. They left Placerville in the Central Pacific, calculated that a transcontinental railroad would be very lucrative, both in passengers and trains and freight hauling. And the California gold and the Nevada silver needed equipment to continue the mining process. So I also found that a railroad station could make a city very, very rich. The U.S. railroad decision in 1862 was the Pacific Railroad Act. That was signed by Abraham Lincoln. The North was chosen because the construction started during the Civil War, and the North had the votes in the Congress. And the North also had the manufacturing and the money to build the track. So that's why you find that the Transcontinental Railroad was in the North. The contract winners in the Central Pacific started building in Sacramento, going east over the Sierra Nevadas. And it was Leland Stanford, who was governor of California at the time between 1862 and 1863, that helped get that contract. And it was the Union Pacific that built westward, and they started in Omaha, Nebraska on July 1862. But the man behind the whole concept, the engineer, was Theodore Judah. He was the Central Pacific's chief engineer, and he surveyed potential routes and lobbied Congress for governmental support, and he met a gentleman named Doc Strong, who was a druggist in Dutch Flatch, which is one of the cities you go over if you're going between Auburn or Sacramento and Reno. This druggist showed him an unbroken ridgeline between the foothills of California and the Immigrant Gap over Donner Summit, and that became the route of the Central Pacific Railroad. It is now the route of the Central Pacific Railroad, and then the Highway 80. And he said, we've drawn the elephant. Now let's see if we can harness them up. And that meant we've got a big project, and let's see if we can make it work. But he did mistrust his partners. And he ended up traveling to New York to arrange some financing to buy out what was later known as the Big Four. And while crossing the Isthmus of Panama going back to New York, Judah contracted yellow fever, and he died November 2nd, 1863. Never got to see the project to fruition. And that's a monument to Theodore Judah, died in 1863. He was the chief engineer. And if you go down to Sacramento, you can, in Old Town Sacramento, this is a statue and a monument given to Theodore Judah. But some of the leaders of the Central Pacific was Stanford, Crocker, Huntington, and Hopkins. Now, Leland Stanford was born in 1824, and he lived until 1893. And he was born in New York, and he He entered an elite law practice to prepare as a career for an attorney. He passed his bar exam in 1848, and he moved to Wisconsin to practice law. Then a little bit later, he moved to California, where several of his brothers had already found success as being a merchant. And Stanford brought some political influence to the railroad partnership that ensured his privately financed project had all the advantages of public funding. You got to remember, he was a California governor. And he was the Civil War governor in 1862 to 1863. And that's when the railroad contract was given. And he was certainly one of the big four who built the California Central Pacific Railroad. And here's a picture of a train. If you go to Old Town Sacramento, inside the Railroad Museum, which is a world-class railroad museum, you'll find a picture with the name Governor Stanford on the train. Charles Crocker. He was born in New York. When he was 14, he moved to the farm in Iowa. And he became very independent at a young age, working on farms and sawmills and an iron forge. And in 1845, he did indeed found an iron forge plant in northern Indiana. In 1849, he left Indiana to follow his older brother Edwin to California, and he led a team of immigrants to Sacramento. He got here in 1850. He was the only Central Pacific Board member who actually traveled any portion of the Pacific Railroad. Crocker was the one that was hands-on with the workers that was actually laying the track. The other three were either political or financial. And he opened a store in Sacramento, the Crocker store. We'll show you a picture of it in just a moment. By 1854, he was one of the wealthiest men in Sacramento. Collis Huntington. At 14, he left home. He saved every penny. And it was said that it was an early indication of his extraordinarily thrift, his patience and his determination. And he started a general merchant at the age of 22. And in 1849, he came to San Francisco through Panama, but he was detained for 3 months while he was waiting for that northbound ship to go from San Francisco to Panama. And during that time, he bought and sold merchandise. He walked back and forth across the isthmus 24 times. And he left for California with $1,200, and he ended up arriving in California to do all of his extra work while he was traveling with $5,000. And once he was in Sacramento, he started a store out of a little tent, and in 1855 he entered a partnership with a man named Mark Hopkins. It was reported that he felt buying politicians for financial gain was simply just a cost of doing business. And he passed in 1900, and his nephew Henry Huntington married his aunt Arabella. And 13 years later, he inherited the entire estate of the Huntington fortune. He moved to Los Angeles and developed land and railroads, and now is known as Huntington Beach. And you can see a picture of the railroad train that has the name Huntington on it. This is one of the first trains that came across to California. It became one of the workhorses, and it was rebuilt in Sacramento, California today, and that's what it looks like today. Mark Hopkins, the last of the four. He was born in 1813 to a Puritan family who said that he could squeeze 106 cents out of every dollar. And he started a business career as a clerk at the age of 16, and he was studying law by 1837. But he sold out. He went to California in 1849 to find that gold. And he opened a store in Placerville, California. And later he opened a wholesale grocery and went into business with Huntington. And this is a picture at Old Town Sacramento where you can see the Huntington Hopkins hardware store. And that's where they really started to make a lot of money, is supplying the gold miners with the picks and the shovels and the pans and everything that a gold miner needed. They could find it at Huntington and Hopkins hardware store. And they became very, very rich. And this is a catalog and price list of the Huntington, Hopkins and Company, Sacramento and in San Francisco. Well, the railroad land grants from the United States grants started in 1862, and it was Stephen A. Douglas in 1850 that arranged this checkerboard compromise to create a federal land grant for the railroads, and he was involved with the Illinois Central Railroad. And it used the Illinois Central Railroad actually used Abraham Lincoln as their attorney when Lincoln was practicing as an attorney. And in 1862, President Lincoln signed the largest railroad land grants into law. So Abraham Lincoln had many facets to him, and one of them was his interest in railroads and developing the United States. The projected profits was upward of $13 million of gold were estimated to have been paid in a single year for the team freights. That would just get the freight from the Virginia City mines to Sacramento and San Francisco. And that was a one-way trip across the Sierra Nevadas. In Tahoe, there's a gentleman named Carlo Giuseppe Celio, and he was a teamster, and he owns a big ranch out in Christmas Valley, or what is better known as Upper Lake Valley. And the Central Pacific Railroad projected charging a maximum of rates of 10 cents per mile for passengers and 15 cents per ton per mile for freight. And these freight prices were actually 1/3 less than what was paid for if you put it over wagons that were pulled by mules or horses. So they knew, the Central Pacific Railroad knew they'd have profits if they could just get the railroad over the mountains. So the first 2 years, only 45 miles of track were laid. And there's some railroad profiteering going on. They received land grants, and it was given as $16,000 per mile on an easy grade. $32,000 per mile on a hilly area, and $48,000 per mile if it was in a mountain area. So the harder it was to build, the more money they got. And it was interesting that the Union Pacific Railroads were granted 400 feet right-of-ways plus 10 square miles of land for every mile of track they built. So they're getting land wealthy. And in 1864, 20 square miles and the mineral rights were added. And in difficult terrain, up to 50 square miles for each mile of track that was laid. So it was interesting that the Sierra Nevada boundary, which was your mountainous area, was resurveyed. And amazingly, the boundary was extended towards Sacramento, making it so they make more profit per mile. And Central Pacific Railroad would eventually get more money for building in the mountain area, so the Sierra Nevadas actually grew in land boundary, so they get more profits per mile. And here's a picture if you go to the railroad station in Old Town Sacramento of the Big Four starting up the first Transcontinental Railroad. And there's, just to give you an idea on the railroad private land ownership, eventually the railroad received from the federal government a total of more than 11 million acres in California. Actually, about 11.5% of the entire area of the state was owned by the railroads. And the Central Pacific and the Southern Pacific Railroad companies were the original recipients of 24 million acres of land from the U.S. government under that land grant. And over the years, both railroad companies developed, traded, and sold off millions of acres. And today, the current railroad company operation in the original right-of-way is the Union Pacific Railroad Company, which still owns the original land grants in the western United States. But today, the largest private landowner in California is the Sierra Pacific Lumber, and they own a little over 1,300,000 acres in California. But here's a picture of the United States, and in the aqua color was the land ownership of the railroads. And that's just a lot of land. They were very wealthy with land. But here's a picture of Lake Tahoe, as you can see here in the corner. And the shaded portion is the Central Pacific Railroad land. And as you remember, we're talking about those checkerboards patterns. A lot of land on the top of the Sierra Nevadas over in Highway 80 is actually owned by the railroad company. And you have to buy and sell from the railroad, because every mile that they had produced, they get 50 square miles of land around where they laying track. So a lot of Tahoe is owned by the railroads, and has been sold from the railroads to different companies for different purposes. But the Chinese workers, they were exceptional. They were the ones that actually built the railroads. The labor and finances were the biggest problems. While the workers would often hire on in Sacramento, they'd ride to the end of the track as a freeloader just to get to the gold mines by train, and then they wouldn't work. In 1865, Charles Crocker tried Chinese workers. And at the time, the discrimination against the Chinese was really rampant in California. And they were actually called Crocker's pets. And they were migrant workers. But in California now, still help California. The Chinese workers, it was stated that they were a great army laying siege to nature's strongest citadel. And without them, it would be impossible to go on with the work, according to Crocker. And he said, I can assure you, the Chinese are moving the earth and rock rapidly. They prove very nearly equal to white men in the amount of labor they perform, and they are far more reliable. Without the Chinese, we would not have the railroads over the Sierra Nevadas. And they would carry much of the rock and soil on their backs. And it was just a bunch of them, and they worked extremely hard and got the job done. And Crocker made that statement. The Chinese built the Great Wall of China and invented gunpowder, didn't they? Well, they could certainly get the tracks over the Sierra Nevadas. And they actually had the record of laying 10 miles of track in one day. And sometimes 8 to 12 inches per day when they're tunneling through the Sierra Nevadas. But when they got on flat ground, they could really make a lot of mileage. And that record happened in April 28, 1869. But here's a picture of the railroad track going through by Donner Lake over the Sierra Nevadas, where they had the tunnels. And here's a close-up view of the tunnels, and you can see tunnels all along here. And the reason they put the tunnels up there is that when the heavy snows, the trains wouldn't have to plow that particular area. Now, since then, and recently, they've had a tunnel that goes 2 miles underneath the Sierra Nevadas, and they don't use this portion of the railroad track any longer. But there's Donner Pass, right where Highway 80 goes through. And here's a picture or a drawing of the tunnels that the train would go through for miles and miles. And if you're a passenger, the smoke from the smokestack would be choking, and the engineers, it would be tough to get through. But at least you could go over simply because you didn't have to deal with the snow on the tracks. The track went over Donner Summit in September 1867, and the tracks actually met in Union Pacific at Promontory, Utah, July 22nd, 1869. That's when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And here's a picture of the Transcontinental Railroad in Promontory, Utah, real close to Ogden, Utah. And the Central Pacific started in Sacramento, and they went east, and the Union Pacific started in the east and went to the west, and that's where they met. And that was July 22nd, 1869. But if you're in the Sierra Nevadas, and you had to deal with the snow as a railroad engineer, this was a rotary plow in the 1930s of the Southern Pacific going over the Sierra Nevadas. And there was an older ram that they would use just to open up the railroad tracks over the Sierra Nevadas. It'd take 3 or 4 trains to push that, and you just go through the snow tunnels. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad crossed the United States, stopped in Reno. What was Truckee called before it was called Truckee? Question I have. It was called Gray's Toll Station, and then it was called Colbert Station. And when the Central Pacific Railroads began their ascent over the Sierra foothills, Colburn Station was selected as the advanced camp. They would take materials over there and they'd build from both sides of the Sierra Nevadas, and that's where their construction crews were. But the settlement grew into a lumber town. In 1868, Nevada City Daily Transcript pronounced the name Colburn Station has been discarded by the people of that town and is now called Truckee. And Truckee was named for the Paiute Indian chief, who was very, very popular with the white men. But here's a picture of Truckee. If you go to the Truckee Railroad Station, you'll see this. In 1863, Truckee was known as Gray's Toll Station, and it grew and it grew and it grew. It became Colbert Station and became Truckee. But what was Reno called before it was called Reno? It was actually Fuller's Crossing. It's going over South Virginia Street. If you go through Reno, you go over a river. in downtown Reno, and that's the place where Fuller's Crossing was. And then it became Lake Station, and there's the biggest little city in the world. That's what it looks like now. And real close to there, that's where the Transcontinental Railroad was going right, not far from this sign right here. It was named after a gentleman called Major General Jesse Lee Reno, and he died on September 14th, 1862 in the South Mountain Battle in the Civil War. It was right before Antietam, Sparksburg, and during that Antietam-Sparksburg battle, 23,000 soldiers died in 12 hours. So one of the bloodiest battles in the shortest period of time in the Civil War. When and where was the first railroad connected to the Atlantic from the Pacific? Because most people think it's the Transcontinental Railroad that goes across the United States in 1869, but actually it was the Panama Railway. And that was completed in 1855. Because most people going to California who did not go overland came via boat. And they came from the East Coast, and they came from Louisiana. They go down to Panama, they get on a train in Panama, go over that isthmus there, get on another boat, a ship that would go from Panama to San Francisco, California. And that was the most popular way, the quickest way to get to California at that time. And it was only 48 miles across Panama. Now they have locks and ships can go across Panama, that Panama Canal. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Virginia Truckee Railroad. It was 1865, William Sharon of the Bank of California that incorporated the Virginia Truckee Railroad. And in 69 there was 16 miles of track. It took 21 miles of railroad and it started 6 months after the Central Pacific was completed. But it was so curvy, it took 21 miles of railroad just to do 16 miles of track. It was based in Carson City, and in 1875 it started its passenger service and ran until 1938. And it was recently started up again in a wonderful trip to take a family on, going from Carson City to Virginia City. Now the question I had is, if the railroad company was named Virginia Truckee Railroad, why did the track run from Reno to Virginia City? It didn't start from Truckee, but it ended in Virginia City. Well, Reno is built on the Truckee Meadows, and that's why they called it the Virginia Truckee Railroad. And the name would have been better. It would have been better named if you said Virginia City Truckee Meadows Railroad, but that's not the way it was pulled out. So but that's how they named it. So here's a picture of from Reno to Carson City, and then from Carson City up to Virginia City. It actually went down to Minden for a while anyway. And that is the close-up of a very crooked railroad. And the branch Virginia City to Carson City earned the name the crookedest railroad in the world, and made enough turns in a trip to go around a circle 17 times. Very steep, very curvy, and very slow. And it also went through 6 tunnels. And all this within 16 miles. So here's the Virginia Truckee Railroad locomotive called Genoa. And this would be called what is described here as a 440. There's 4 idler wheels and 4 drive wheels, and no wheels in the back that that push the train. So this is a 440. And you see some of the trains will come up differently. This is the number 12, the Genoa on the Virginia Truckee Railroad. This is also known as a 440 train. That's how they named them. And there's other trains that you can see here. This would be a 260. As you can see, that's how they describe it. This has 6 wheels that are driving. They'd use these kind of trains because it had more traction, more wheels per train that would allow them to pull up hills, and they wouldn't fall off the track near as much. This one was called the Empire. And here's a picture of the Empire at the California State Museum in Sacramento. So there's a 260, the Virginia Truckee Railroad. And it's in mint condition. And here was a popular sign in Lake Tahoe where it talked about the Virginia and Truckee Railroad trains. You could go from Benton State Line, you could be picked up by Benton Stage Line from the Virginia Truckee Railroad. You come up to Tahoe, you go on the steamer Niagara, and you can stay at the Lakeshore House as a weekend trip. Some of the Pacific Union and Virginia Truckee Railroad workers stayed in Tahoe to help lay tracks in lumber train tracks up here in Tahoe. Well, you know your Tahoe local if you realize that washing your car is a better predictor of stormy weather than the National Weather Service. And here's some Tahoe-based railroad trains. So I have a picture of the Virginia Truckee Railroad from 1869 to 1938. But the first train in the Lake Tahoe Basin was actually started in 1872, a man named Matthew Gardner. There's a mountain named after him, it's Gardner Mountain, close by the Y. And it lasted until 1865. And it started in Camp Richardson and would go all the way out to Sawmill Pond, and what's now known as Lake Tahoe Boulevard. The second train that came in the Tahoe Basin was in 1875. D.L. Bliss had a train that went from Glenbrook to Spooner Summit, and it lasted till 1898. And that was called the Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company. Carson Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company put that together. Up at North Shore, where Incline Village is, a man named Hobart put a railway up there in 1878. It just went across the North Shore for a little while, and it lasted till 1897. And that train was called the Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber Company. And they'd bring the wood down here at North Shore. They'd go up the incline, and we'll show you a picture of the incline in just a little bit. And then through flumes, they would get the wood on the other side of Sierra Nevadas, floated downhill after they built a 3/4 mile tunnel. And then down in the South Shore in 1884, a gentleman named Chubbuck put a railroad together. It was actually had wooden railroads, and it didn't last for very long. And it was bought up in 1888 by Bliss, D.L. Bliss, and it went from the area of Bijou all the way out to Myers, and they tore that train up in 1898, and that was called the Lake Valley Railroad. Well, in 1899, Bliss took all the trains from the South Shore that he owned, and he took them up to Tahoe City, and he had a track that went from Tahoe City to Truckee, and that started 1899 and stopped actually in 1942. There's some people today alive that have been on that train, and that was called the Lake Tahoe Railroad and Transportation Company. And then there was a little spur in 1903 for Ward Creek, and that's where you got the lumber. That didn't haul people. Now the South Shore trains, where the 1872 the Matthew Gardner, he leased timber rights to the South Shore. Camp Richardson was a little bit west of Lake Valley, and he brought the V&T number 2 engine, the Ormsby 260 Mongolian. It had 9 flat cars, and they'd load the wood onto the flat cars, and they'd take the lumber down to the lake and throw or take the trees down the lake and float them over to Glenbrook. The railroads they used, the first 260 were examples of that increased pulling power because they had more wheels on the track. But they were rigid in suspension and made them more prone to derailments than the 440. So if you had a train that had to make a lot of curves, you'd use a 440 because it was less stiff. But if you had too high of an incline, the 440 couldn't pull near as fast if you had a steep incline. But it stopped in 1885. And there's a picture of the number 13 Empire. And this would be a 260 steamer. But there was wood and more wood that was required for the Virginia City mines. Desperately needed it. And there was not less than 80 million board feet of timber and lumber were consumed annually on the Comstock load. And more than 2 million cords of wood were burned as the fuel for hoisting works and by the mills. a man named Elliot Lord estimated that in 1880 that 600 million board feet of lumber buried in the Comstock mines was enough to build a town of 6-room houses for 150,000 people. And the Comstock used a method of timbering devised by Philip Eisenhower. He was a German engineer directing the work at the Ophir mine, and though they needed a lot of trees to make the holding up the Comstock, using the Philip Eisenhower method of holding up, keeping the mines from caving in. Once they started using that, there were no more deaths on cave-ins after Eisenhower came to help the square set timbering. And they used large timbers, and timbers are still under Virginia City. And a man named D.L. Bliss, he bought the timberlands from a man named Prey, who owned the lumber mill at Glenbrook. So Bliss had managed originally a small bank in Gold Hill, Nevada, real close to Virginia City, and that was taken over by the Bank of California. And Bliss was known as honest and dependable man, though the Bank of California wasn't. It needed an honest forerunner. It was known as the bank ring, as Ralston's ring, referring to the Bank of California in San Francisco's headquarters. What they had a tendency to do would be buy up, loan miners some money so they can dig the mine, and if the mine didn't hit big, then they would foreclose on the mine, and then they would end up owning the mine. And they did this over and over again. They had a real rough reputation for doing that. But they had this man, D.L. Bliss. He had an honest heart. And so they used him to purchase Prairie Meadows and the mills, and eventually had control of 50,000 acres of forest land in the Tahoe area. And taking what was profitable, selling to purchase the next tree property. So what he would do is he would clear the trees, the property that he had, and then he would sell that piece of property and buy another piece of property. So he didn't own 50,000 acres all at once. He'd buy them in sections, work it for a year or two, sell that land, and he'd go to the next section that had timber on it. Or he'd lease property that had timber on it and got permission to take the wood off of that property that he leased. He connected the log booms, the railroad, and the sawmills, and the flumes. He put it all together. And once the flume was at the top of Spooner Summit, he'd send the lumber down to the Carson Valley, and it would be loaded on the Virginia and Truckee. You'd go up to Virginia City to help keep those mines open. But here's, before D.L. Bliss was there, here's a picture of Prairie Meadows and how busy in Glenbrook. It's now known as Glenbrook, and that's what it looked like back before D.L. Bliss actually bought it. And when Glenbrook had some more mills and a lot of production of lumber and timber at the base of Lake Tahoe. And here's a picture on top of Shakespeare's Rock, looking down into Glenbrook, and you can see the smokestacks of the mills down there that were taking care of the Virginia City Mines lumber needs. And he expressed, he had a financial setback in the business, and a man named Henry Yerington. Now, he was part owners of the Virginia and Truckee, and became partners with D.L. Bliss, and produced the Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company. And they had, 1875, they had two 6-0 locomotives that was named the Glenbrook and the Tahoe. And 3 years later, they had 2 more trains were added because of the big demand. And here's engine number 1. It was said that for one trip from the Lake Tahoe Basin on the shoreline to the top of Spooner Summit would take a full load of wood in the tinder boiler. That's how much power it took to get those trains up the hill. And if you look at this train, you can see the smokestack, and as you see how it goes wide, that's to help, you'll know that's a wood-burning engine. And if it was narrow, it would be a coal-burning steam engine. In 1875, the D.L. Bliss had a switchback track from Glenbrook sawmills at the lake level, and it went up to the top of Spooner Summit. at the top of Clear Creek Canyon. There's 9 miles over 10 trestles, and at the very top it had a 270-foot long tunnel. And the lumber would be unloaded. It'd be floated down a 12-mile V-flume to Carson City, and the V&T Railroad would take it all the way to Virginia City from that point. But here's a map of the railroad here at Lake Tahoe. This is Glenbrook. This is where the lumber mills are, and the trains would go up Slaughterhouse Canyon, make a couple of switchbacks, and get top of Spooner Summit, and they would unload the wood at the top, and then down Clear Creek Canyon, they'd float the wood 12 miles, and that's where Virginia City would pick it up. I'm going to give a close-up picture of this area. That's where the trains went, to the top of Spooner Summit. And right at the very top was that tunnel. And then the flume went all the way down, almost to Carson City. But here's in green is the road that people use, of the current Highway 50, and as you're going down over Spooner Summit to get to Carson City. And there's that tunnel at the top. Here's a close-up picture of the switchbacks, where you can see where the train would start at Glenbrook, or go through Slaughterhouse Canyon, make a couple of switchbacks. They'd go here, they would stop the train, put it in reverse, and back up here, stop the train, switch the tracks, and then go forward. So it would switch back and forth. That was going up the hill. And that's the Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company. And here's another picture of the exact same route. Here's Glenbrook down here, here's Slaughterhouse Canyon, and there's the switchbacks back and forth, and then you get up to past Spooner Lake. And over to Spooner Summit where that tunnel was. Now the tunnel's no longer there, they filled in the tunnel, so you can see where it was, but you can't go through it anymore. And once you got to the top, this Spooner Summit, the V-flume, and you can see the logs floating down 12 miles down to Virginia City to get that lumber to Carson City, then to Virginia City via the railroad. And when you get to Carson City, this is what you would see. You see the railroad track. They would have the V-flumes on both sides, and they'd unload the logs onto the platform, and from the platform they'd get it onto the train. And that's how they got. That's a lot of man hours to do all that. But the lumber railroad on the South Shore, the Lake Valley Railroad that we talked about, the 1884 George Washington Chubbuck. He had started the Bijou Pier for about a mile to Trout Creek and to Myers, and it started with wooden rails, and it was pulled by oxen. And later he used a locomotive. It was actually in a tunnel, the Sutro Tunnel. We used that locomotive for a while and traveled all of 8 miles an hour. And it traveled on wood rails. He sold out to D.L. Bliss in 1888 and replaced the wooden rails with steel rails. But this is what the old Ormsby looked like. Ormsby, 8 miles an hour, and it was on wooden tracks. And here's a picture of, you can see if you go to Bijou Park in South Lake Tahoe on Al Tahoe Boulevard, and it's right across the street from Lake Tahoe Community College. This is a replica of what D.L. Bliss had. As you look down here, there are the log railroad ties. The railroad were steel, but they would use logs for the railroad ties at one point in time. And those were the newer steel rails. The Lake Valley Railroad went from Bijou to Myers, and it was about a half-mile pier was built out into the lake to dump the logs into the lake, and it was pulled by the 10-ton Santa Cruz. It came from Santa Cruz Felton Railroad and borrowed other locomotives from Glenbrook. And at the maximum, they were 11.5 miles long. They almost went out to Myers. But this is what they did prior to the trains. They would have the trains pulled by the oxen, where the lumber would be put on beds. And here's a picture of the Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company engine. Number 3 was a 260. 260. And here's a picture of the train that had a light on the front to be working at night, and it also had a light in the back, so all you have to do is just put it in reverse. So it can go both ways. And there's a little puppy looking onto the railroad track from the barge. But up in Incline Village, let's go to North Shore. In 1873, Walter Scott Hobart, he established the Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber Company. And in 1878, he had completed the steam-powered sawmill up in Incline Village. And in 1879, Incline Village was nothing but a strip forest land in that area. And he took all the wood out of there. And now some of the most expensive land in the Tahoe area is up there. Some say the name should change to Income Village. But it's actually Incline Village because of the incline. It was named after the incline. Here's a picture of the incline. And the wood would go straight up and then unload the wood into a flume, and they would go through a 3/4 mile tunnel on a flume and then get down into Virginia City. But that's what the incline looked like. It was 1,600 feet straight up the mountainside. But that stopped in 1897. And here's another picture, a side view of going up the incline of Incline Village. That was a railroad track. And there's one of Hobart's trains, and a little train station down there. But it wasn't for passengers, it was only for lumber. And it wasn't, there's a couple of little trains there. It was narrow gauge. In the late 1880s, Bliss began plans that would eventually result in the Lake Tahoe Railway and Transportation Company. It was Tahoe's North Shore for lumber supplies and passenger transport from Truckee to Tahoe City. In 1899, he actually started the Lake Tahoe Railroad and Transportation Company. It was narrow gauge through Truckee, River Canyons, primarily how you go on the road today for Highway 89. And they used old lumber trains that came from the South Shore. The lumber demand was decreased because the Virginia City mines dried up, and so they took the trains and made them mostly passenger trains. In 1926, the rails were replaced to standard gauge, and they added a Pullman car to go from Truckee to Tahoe City. And later, the Southern Pacific acquired the line, and the last train from Truckee to Tahoe City was in 1942. They were pulled up the track during the Second World War. And here's a picture of number 5, the Lake Tahoe Railroad and Transportation Company. It's a 440, went from Tahoe City to Truckee, and it's about 1907. And here's a picture of the Truckee River with one of the trains coming by the Truckee train tracks. Now, before the train came, what they were using is stagecoach and wagons to get from Truckee to Tahoe City. And once you got to Lake Tahoe from Truckee, the train would be going out into the pier. And you can see the smokestack from the train right here. And you can get off the train onto the boat, the steamer Tahoe is one of them, and you can go all the way around the lake. Or you could stay at the Tahoe Tavern, which is up here in Tahoe City. That was torn down in 1965. So here's a picture of the train and the steamer Tahoe right next to one another. So if you just took the baggage off the train, put it on the boat, you can get down to South Shore or anywhere else around Lake Tahoe. There's still evidence of train tracks in the South Shore. If you go to Lake Tahoe Community College, you can see where the old tracks were on road number 5. And you can see the switchback trail in Glenbrook. You have to go through, this is what's called Devil's Gate, and this is where the tracks went through. It's an easy to see landmark if you get down to Glenbrook. So, in review, here's the 1872, started with Camp Richardson's a sawmill by Matthew Gardner. Then the D.L. Bliss came in 1875, and he started the Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company. And then Hobart's in 1878 started in Incline Village the Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber Company. And down here on the South Shore, 1884, Chubbuck started the railroad down there, was taken over by Bliss in 1888, and it went all the way from Bijou to Myers, and that was called the Lake Valley Railroad. And in 1899, they took the trains from the South Shore, put them on the North Shore, and had them haul people from Truckee to Tahoe City, and that was called the Lake Tahoe Railroad and Transportation Company. So those were the main trains that were in the South Shore of Lake Tahoe. There's no trains here anymore, but that's the history of the trains in the Tahoe Basin. And they had that 1903 Ward Creek spur. But there were a couple of, one railroad was started in 1971. It was called the Tahoe, Trout Creek and Pacific Railroad. Some gentleman decided that he wanted to start a narrow gauge railroad as a tourist attraction in the South Shore here. And it went from, there's some old advertising, the Tahoe, Trout Creek and Pacific Railroad. And it lasted for just a couple of years. And it's going back and forth, and you can get on and ride for a while. And here's a map of the old Tahoe Trout Creek Railroad. And right here's where Trout Creek Bridge is over Highway 50, and it went from here to here. This is a map that showed some people who lived here in their late 60s, early 70s would recognize the Outdoorsman. It's now known as the grocery outlet. And this is where Lake Tahoe Community College is, if you want to go out and see where the old track was. You don't see any more, the track's not there anymore, but you can see where it went. And so this is my presentation of the coming of the railroads to the Lake Tahoe Basin. My name is David Borges. I want to thank you for sharing Tahoe history with me.
Lake Tahoe, the jewel of the Sierra, is the most beautiful place in the world. Nature's wonderland, surrounded by majestic mountains above and beautiful sapphire blue waters below that splash upon the 72 miles of shoreline at a depth of 1,645 feet. Waterfalls are plentiful with their dramatic beauty as they splash against the granite rocks below. 63 different streams flow into the lake. Tahoe is an excellent destination for a variety of visitors. There's something for everyone. Nature's playground, with trails that take you deep into our gorgeous forests and pristine alpine lakes surrounded by meadows with wildflowers. Hiking and exploring nature's wonderland is an experience you'll never forget. The peaceful energy that flows through your body when you walk in the forest and the healing sights and sounds of nature refresh your mind and soul. Come with us on an adventure to treasure. Pick your favorite hike. The hike to Eagle Lake is only 1 mile, but offers magnificent rewards. You have spectacular views of the falls and wonderful, breathtaking vistas of Emerald Bay and Lake Tahoe. This is definitely a snapshot favorite, so don't forget your camera. To get there, travel approximately 8 miles from the Y on Highway 89. The parking lot is on your left. You have to pay here, so get your wallet out. You will have to fill out a permit and carry it with you, because this is an entrance to Desolation Wilderness. Let's head for the falls. Morgan points out a trail marker. Either way will take you to the falls. Stop and enjoy the view of the falls from this bench like Michelle and Morgan are doing. We continue on the trail, stopping at the bridge to admire the full splendor of Eagle Falls. It's just magnificent the way the colors change as the water travels downstream. Let's cross the bridge and be on our way. We have an adventure waiting for us. The trail to Eagle Lake becomes rocky and steep for a while, but it is well worth the effort. Here's the Desolation Wilderness sign to remind us to have our permit filled out and displayed. About halfway to the lake, you come to these wide-open, giant granite slabs. This is a great spot to stop and take advantage of the views. Pictures are a must. This is one of the most photographed places in the world, and you can sure see why. This view of Emerald Bay is priceless. These sheer mountain ranges that surround us are breathtaking with that beautiful blue sky as a backdrop. Here's the trail marker for Velma Lakes to your left or Eagle Lakes to your right. This trail is truly spiritual as you hike beneath the sheer mountain range. Here it is, our reward just ahead, Eagle Lake. So pristine and brilliant. Dallas and Dakota think so too. Everyone seems to be enjoying a perfect summer day at Eagle Lake. If you have a choice, hike to Cascade Falls as early in the spring or summer as possible. This will afford you the opportunity to observe these magnificent falls at their peak. The views of Cascade Lake and Lake Tahoe are breathtaking. To get there, travel 7.5 miles from the Y on Highway 89. After you have gone past the part of the road that is split by Cascade Lake on your left and Emerald Bay on your right, you make the first left into the Bayview Trailhead. Go through the campsites and park in the parking lot. You don't need to fill out a permit if you are only going to the falls. This hike is about 1 mile and is easy to moderate with views well worth your efforts. Here's our sign, Cascade to the left. This part of the trail is flat and sandy. Well, that didn't last long. We have to climb to get to our spectacular views of Lake Tahoe and Cascade Lake. The views are what make this hike outstanding. Look at all the sugar pine cones on that sugar pine tree. They look like Christmas decorations. Cascade Lake sure is beautiful, with the falls cascading down 200 feet into the lake. Rains were predicted for this afternoon. Not to worry, Michelle and I have our rain ponchos with us. This is a very popular trail, as you can see. Now you can see Cascade Falls in all her glory. The view from here of Cascade Lake below and Lake Tahoe just beyond is truly magnificent, even with the clouds looming above us today. You can walk along the stream until you find a little pool to have your picnic at, or sit on these giant slabs of granite and take in the views. What a spectacular sight as the falls plummet 200 feet into Cascade Creek that flows into Cascade Lake. Oh no, raindrops. Oh well, they did predict rain this afternoon. We better scoot. Horsetail Falls are the most spectacular falls in the area. You hike up granite slabs and along Pyramid Creek, where there are lovely pools carved into the granite and spectacular views. To get there, travel 11 miles west towards Sacramento on Highway 50 to Twin Bridges. Turn right at the parking lot. You will have to pay here, so get your wallet out. You will also need to fill out a wilderness permit. The distance is just 1 mile. However, you will be climbing 400 feet, so pace yourself. There are plenty of gorgeous vistas on this hike, so stop, catch your breath, and enjoy your views. Sam and the dogs get started up the trail. Shortly, you come to the giant slabs of granite and Pyramid Creek. We'll continue up the trail as we follow the creek for a while, which allows us to be in the shade. These beds of giant ferns are sure pretty. If you're ever in doubt about where you are on the trail, look for these markers to help guide you. These views are really something from these wide open spaces. The stream beds help keep us cool. We might catch a spray from the water tumbling over these sloping rocks. Careful not to get too close, the rocks are slippery. And in the early spring, the water is traveling at vigorous speeds. There's Lover's Leap, which challenges many a rock climber. Now we get a good look at Horsetail Falls. These falls are the granddaddy of them all for this area and attract many hikers. This trail is an entrance to Desolation Wilderness. Just beyond this sign, you will come to this beautiful pool where you can cool off like the dogs. This is a great place to stop and laze around for a while or have a picnic. We're going up the trail further today. We want a closer look at these wonderful falls. Here we have found a perfect spot to admire their splendor. Sam and I will stop here at this heavenly spot and enjoy the water. Are you trying to give Isabella a bath? What a great day to hike up to Horsetail Falls. The hike to Grass Lake is full of history, as the Glen Alpine Springs was a popular destination in the early 1900s. You hike up the same old road that the wagons used to carry guests to the springs. Grass Lake sits nestled in nature's wonderland and has a view of the spectacular falls from Susie Lake. To get there, travel approximately 3 miles from the Y, turn left on Fallen Leaf Road. Travel approximately 2 miles past the campgrounds where the road comes to a Y, stay to the right. Travel 2.5 miles to the marina and follow the road up to Lily Lake where there's free parking. For the 2.5-mile hike to Grass Lake, you will need a wilderness permit. The first section of this trail was an old road all the way to the springs. Here we are at the majestic Modjeska Falls. These falls were named after Madame Helena Modjeska, an opera singer from Virginia City in the 1880s who was a frequent visitor to the area. Glen Alpine Springs was founded by Nathan Gilmore in the 1880s. He bottled the spring water and sold it. He advertised it as the best soda water found in the Pacific Crest Mountain Range. Some of the old buildings are still standing on the famous site and are being restored. Tent camping was another option for the many visitors to the springs. If you want, you can still sample that famous soda water. When we leave the springs, the trail becomes more of a trail than a road. It's about 1/2 mile until you reach the Grass Lake turnoff from here. We have all this open space to enjoy. When you reach the trail marker, make a left to Grass Lake. We continue on the trail until we come to a stream that Dallas seems to like. Cross over at the log. A short distance from here, we reach our destination, Grass Lake. Just look at this gorgeous place. Everywhere you look is so overwhelming with nature's beauty. These are the falls from Susie Lake. The falls in the mountain range that open up to the blue skies make this a very special lake. Even if you just want to sit and take it all in like David, or take a swim like Dallas, it's all here for you to enjoy.